Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. I think one of the biggest risks that you can be faced with as an aspiring artist is overlooking a lot of the simple tools and techniques and processes that have come before that just work. And what I want to do in this video is talk about one of those processes. This is where we create illustrations using a simple pencil drawing that we scan and color in Photoshop. Now, this is essentially the same technique that I've been using for decades. I used the same process and idea on the Seven Pirates book, which was the first book I ever had published. I created all of the pages as, finished pencil drawings. I then scanned those into Photoshop, tweaked the levels, adjusted them, cleaned them up, and then colored the entire book in Photoshop. I also created a very similar sort of process with the Mythic Arcana project, which was a card game that I created with my friend Tony Go. There were over 70 finished card illustrations that needed to be created for this, and I actually found that using that traditional process really fit the style and feel of the project and was pretty economical from a scheduling and time point of view. So it's something that we can still use today, even though there's a lot of other digital tools and techniques available. So there's essentially two parts to this process. The first is where we create the pencil drawing. Now, this is the pencil drawing for that cover. This is probably a little bit more polished and time consuming than what we're going to deal with in this tutorial. We're going to do more of a spontaneous pin-up style illustration, and I'll talk about why I think that's really, really important, especially when you're just starting out in the beginning. The second part will deal with how you would actually take that pencil drawing into Photoshop, scan it, and then add color. We'll talk about cleaning up the drawing, adjusting the contrast, and also, potentially adding color effects to the lines and a lot of other things that can plus the final look and feeling of polish. So there'll actually be two separate videos. This is the first one focusing on the pencil drawing phase, and the second video, which you can find on the channel when it's out, or I'll leave a link below in the description, will deal with the scanning and the coloring in Photoshop. But anyway, let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome again to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, the Drawing Codex, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you're interested in line and color illustration and you'd like to learn a little bit more about my processes, you can check out my free Quick Start Guide. Now, that Quick Start Guide is designed mostly to help you get up and running quickly in Photoshop, creating the lines in Photoshop as well. But you'll be able to use many of the same concepts and ideas, as well as brushes and Photoshop techniques that I use in this tutorial. So I recommend you check that out so you can follow along. As I said, we're going to be creating slightly more of a spontaneous illustration process in this case. Now, one of the things I talk about frequently is the importance of thumbnails and your ability to take a sort of thumbnail or a plan or a rough for your drawing and turn it into a finished image. But I think often there are many other different ways to create art, and thinking about it from a spontaneous point of view, I think, is really key. This is where what we'll be doing is taking something that is a little bit more like an idea or a sketch from our sketchbook, something that we're creating, again, not with a really, really detailed plan in mind. And what we're going to do is work on some of those compositional elements, some of the hierarchy of detail, where our focus is going to be, what the toenail layout is going to be. We're going to be doing that in Photoshop kind of on the fly. Now, again, this is a different skill that you're going to build versus, the professional illustration process. But I think it's just as important because often what we're lacking in those kind of highly polished processes is the spontaneity and the ability to spot happy accidents and go with the flow a little bit more. Now, again, what you end up with as you practice both your, your ability to reliably take a thumbnail to a finished image, and your ability to kind of take, some sort of sketch that maybe you've done or something that's a little bit rougher, take it into Photoshop and sort of create something that has illustrative quality, that has, a good sense of balance and a good way that it's going to lead the eye through the page. They're both really important skills, I think, because often, even though you may plan things well, they don't always end up going the way you planned. And being able to react and respond and figure out, like, how do I figure this out? How do I make this interesting on the fly is just as important. And that skill, I think, has really served me well throughout my career. Now, I think this process is really good if you're a little bit more budget constrained with your setup, either where you're starting out and you don't have a big Cintiq and a whole sort of workstation or all this kind of fancy stuff, or if you just don't have access to it, if that's just not an option. I think the idea of just using pencil drawings to create a lot of your art is something that you can definitely take as far as you want from a professional standpoint, and certainly from the standpoint of creating really, really high quality art. I think that the experience you're going to get drawing with pencil on paper is still going to be way superior to the experience you're going to get drawing on a drawing screen. And although there are challenges to drawing traditionally and trying to make sort of finished illustrations out of it, like there's no control, Z, there's no undo, there's no warp, I think that working that way actually forces you to perfect your craft a little bit better. And there's a lot of benefits that come along with that as well. So even though it's a little bit more lo-fi, I think the things that forces you to do will serve you well, when and if you want to play digitally. And again, that same concept would apply even if you do have a fancy Cintiq. It can really help your drawing ability to be focusing on, the traditional drawing side of things. And those skills will really help you when you are drawing digitally. Again, all of these things are interchangeable. One of the other reasons that I'm going to use a more spontaneous process here is that if you are thinking about working in a professional setting with this type of, again, the pencil drawing style, often what you are going to need to do is do a thumbnail at a small scale and either kind of take that into Photoshop and blow it up so you can print it out, and then sort of trace it underneath your finished work here. Or you're just going to have to get really good at kind of, just transferring by eye a small thumbnail to a large page. Either way, I feel like both of those things are actually quite advanced techniques, and I don't want to sort of bog down this tutorial thinking about that too much. That's why, again, I prefer the idea of let's just draw something, take it into Photoshop, and see what we can make and see if we can make it interesting. Anyway, let's jump over to the drawing table and we'll get started. All right, here we are at the drawing table. And so just to give you a little bit of an idea for, the tools I'm going to use and maybe the sort of the finished product that, we're going to sort of aim for. Again, I've got the art that was actually used to create the cover here for Mythic Arcana. And this is just a board game that I created with my friend Tony Go a few years ago. And I think we did a Kickstarter for it. And again, it has a whole box and instruction guide and stuff. And yeah, basically it's just a bunch of cards. That's essentially what we have. And each card is unique. Each card has a unique god from a particular pantheon of mythology on it. And again, all of these cards were created pretty big, using traditional tools, just pencil and paper. Then I scanned them in and did that on and in Photoshop. So that's kind of the process that I'm going to be using. We probably won't get something as clean as this because I'm going to try and just kind of push this a little bit, and maybe again we'll do a lot of the sketching and the preparatory work on the page, whereas this I think had a separate plan for it that would have been printed out, and then I would have sort of traced it onto this, and I think sort of used that as a base to kind of plan things out generally. But you can still see there's a few little sort of sketch marks around the place. It's not super clean line work by any means, but this is normally how I would approach a sort of illustration project or something that was professionally created, if I'm using more traditional tools. So it's you could just kind of start here and just do a drawing, scan it in, but probably what I would have done is maybe started sketching this out and then printed out sort of the finished design that I sort of had, and onto some sort of nice watercolor paper. And yeah, then sort of created this more finished, polished line work, and then we scan it in. One of the things you can see, again, is it's quite big. So, the size of this versus this allows a lot of detail here, even though if you look at it at this scale, there's not actually that much detail there. So the paper that I'm using is Fabriano Artistico. I think it is the bright white sort of version of that. So it's a watercolor paper, and I'm using the smoother sort of version of it. So it has some tooth, but not too much tooth. And it is 100% cotton, high quality watercolor paper. And you can sort of buy it in big sheets, and then you basically cut it up. So it comes in a much bigger sheet than this, and then I have to sort of cut it up. So it's not really meant for what I'm doing. It's more meant for kind of people doing, watercolor work. But the main focus here is I just like the surface of it, and I like the surface of it a little bit better than maybe something like, your other kind of paper that a lot of people would use would be something like a Strathmore 500 series Bristol, which I'm trying to get out over here, which I have used previously on the channel. Both of these papers are high quality, 100% cotton papers, so they'll you can do a lot of professional work on them. You can beat them up and erase. It'll still give you a nice clean result. The paper sort of color here is quite bright white for a watercolor paper, so it'll scan quite well. If you have really sort of dark or sepia toned papers, they can be very hard to scan in properly. So anyway, that's the paper I'm using, but there's nothing particularly special about it. It is just a paper that I kind of found worked, and then I sort of bought a bunch of it, and that's kind of what I have been using. It's the same paper that I actually used for drawing a lot of the comics that I use. So that's the same paper that I used to draw my 7 Pirates book. Again, Fabriano Artistico, the smooth one. Again, I always forget whether it's hot press or cold press or whatever, but whichever one is the smooth one. And yeah, so that's what I'm going to be using. Probably going to be using a mix of some matte Blackwings and probably this Mitsubishi. I forget whether it's. I don't think this is a high uni. It's just a sort of writing pencil with a giant sort of thick lead, and I find that works quite well. Mostly just because it's dark, and it will allow the preparatory sketches that I do to be pretty dark and pretty visible to you on the camera. So those are the tools I'm going to be using. I've got a kneadable eraser here, which probably looks like it's a little bit dirty and in need of replacement, but that's probably what I'll use. And I think some people were asking in the comments, like, what sort of brand is this? I think this is just a Faber-Castell, kneadable eraser. There's probably a bunch of different brands that offer a very similar product. I'm sure they're all made in the same factory somewhere. It is pink though, and you can get it as blue or other sort of fluorescent colors. I actually think it is, even though it's the normal one is gray. I think it is good to have it a color, because then it's easy to see when it's on when it's on your desk, and also it sort of shows you where there is when it's kind of really done. Because if you get a gray one and then you use it a bunch, it's harder to tell whether it's got so much graphite in it that you're almost like putting down graphite instead of taking it away. Whereas when you've got a colored one, once it sort of stops being really nice pink, then that's probably time to replace it and get a new one. But anyway, those are the basic tools, and that's the basic idea behind what we're going to be doing today. We'll probably draw some monster-ish fantasy orc style character, and just sort of see how we go. All right, and magically all of that stuff is gone. So again, I've got a pile of this paper here. We probably only need one sheet of it. And this is basically one of those large, it's a very large sheet that I sort of cut up, and it's created a variety of sheets that I can then use to draw on. So it's still got, again, the ragged watercolor sort of side. I don't really care about that. Again, this is a nice sort of size that will be, probably should be pretty easy to scan. And yeah, what we need is a plan. Now, again, you can just start sketching around, and that's going to be a fine way to do this. It's probably worth me sort of, thinking about and talking about some different sort of strategies for how to do this. But yeah, what I'm sort of imagining, again, is some sort of action pose, and I want to have the character kind of holding a sword or something, right? So we'll have sort of a head up here. Do something like this. Again, just thinking about what we can do. We'll try and add a little bit of sort of, I guess, perspective or foreshortening to it, because that's often something that really makes it feel as if the drawing is hard. It's funny that again, I do find that there are things that people sort of really appreciate about technical drawing, right? So like showing perspective and showing stuff like that, it can often make it feel like, oh, that's very technically advanced. Once you can do a lot of that, often what you find is that, something that's maybe a little bit simpler or more graphic is actually just as good. But anyway, so I'm going to start kind of light here, and I do apologize. For that. I'll try and make it dark as soon as possible. I want to play with sort of something that's kind of a little bit more open mouthed. So this is, again, just blocking out the drawing, thinking about what is going to be where. I'm not considering too much whether or not this is accurate, because we can do another pass to sort of true that out. The most important thing is just thinking about what is where. And again, the approach here for massing in and getting all of this working is very much the sort of be sketchier, mass it in. Right. I'm not thinking about being technical. What I'm thinking about is exactly, where do I want things, and what's the flow and what's the feel going to be like. You'll tend to find, again, the result doing it this way is going to be a little bit looser, and it's not going to have that feeling of solidarity at this point. And what I do is just check the kind of overall kind of dynamic flow of this. Again, we can do some typical fantasy tropes and things. So, I mean, one of the good things to do if you are trying to be a little bit more spontaneous is to really lean into, doing stuff that works, that's going to be, fun and enjoyable. And the more you can do that, the easier it's probably going to be. If we pick, if you go sort of too far out your comfort zone, it's often better to kind of step back and plan things a little bit more. So anyway, that's the basic idea. Maybe we could have some sort of movement or something kind of through the frame to kind of help push the movement one way or another way. And in a second, what we'll do is take this back and do a pass where we really consider and think about what's happening with the perspective and the structure. So from an analytical standpoint, again, we have sort of plan would be the first thing we're doing. And again, often we can talk about that as being a thumbnail. At its core, the stages here are mostly about planning, like having a direction forward that we know that is going to work or that is resolved in our mind. Now, the plan could be a detailed thumbnail. It could be a really detailed thumbnail. It could be here where, again, I'm sort of sketching around on a big bit of paper. The most important thing is that first we kind of have an idea for like what we're going to do. The second thing is that we're going to think about sort of structure and sort of proportion. And again, the plan here is going to include a lot of those things like sort of gesture, right? Gesture, position, what is the feeling of it? Again, having that sort of rough idea here. And then as a third, we're going to sort of add detail, right? Which again, can often be made up of, sort of secondary and tertiary forms. So again, I often explain this a little bit different. It always comes down to the same basic idea. The first thing we need to know is where are we going, and then we need to sort of add structure and figure out a lot of those things in a little bit more detail. So the good thing you'll find about this paper is, like all sort of good quality 100% cotton drawing papers, is, as you can see there, I can just completely erase something and it's not coming back. So what I'll do now is just take back a lot of that sort of graphite, and we'll see where we go. So you can see that's getting all gunked up. And if you do a lot of these, then it can pay to buy a whole bunch of these kneadable erasers. All right, so there you can see again. Now we've got a little bit of something in between. We've got a plan, and it's a little bit rough. What we need to do now is sort of think about the structure and proportion, right? Let's see if we can make the drawing good here. Again, your plan can be whatever you want. Part of being more spontaneous with your process and again, sort of massing these things out, sort of blocking it in, is, again, that's a little bit more of an advanced technique, but that is something that I've been doing since day one. I just wasn't that successful at it in the beginning. And again, it can often feel a little bit more artistic. The trick is to often know how to bridge the gap from your sketchy phase to the sort of structural phase, and how to sort of add stuff to it, right? How to add things to that sort of sketchy phase without kind of ruining the feeling and a lot of those sort of emotions that come from the sketch. So to a certain degree, the only thing you can do to do that is to just experiment and play around with it. But here, what I'm going to be doing is essentially for my own benefit and also for your benefit looking at this, I'm going to place in the basic Loomis mannequin that I often talk about on top of this. And this will just double check, make sure that everything that I'm doing makes sense in some way, shape or form. Because I'm doing this on again, some nice paper. I can pretty much go crazy and all of these things will completely disappear with erasure in the end. So here, this is where again what you'll find is if you've done this rough sketch and your sort of sketchiness and it's sort of way off, then this will be a really good way for you to get it to look accurate. But you may find that you need to redraw a lot of stuff, which is totally fine. Again, the more experienced with it you get, the more you might find that, again, you don't need to actually change that much because your basic first sort of pass has some sort of innate sense of perspective and structure there. So again, that is one of the things to practice and look forward to, and also just understand that the more you work on your foundation, that the easier those things become. So because I've got foreshortening here, I'm going to mass in the basic shape of that forearm. And here, again, it feels like here like that elbow is kind of going a little bit over there. But it felt like maybe this arm was a bit long to begin with, right? So I'm just going to make that a little bit shorter. Right, and then we've got this hand here. Now it feels like, again, this is coming at us. So even though the little mannequin stick figure is going to be useful, there it's more important to mass in a feeling of what that foreshortened limb will look like there. Now these are all concepts, including the mannequin, that I've gone over in previous videos on the channel, so I recommend you check them out if you want those things explained in detail. This is more about how we put it together. So we've got a kneecap here, got a large calf, and here we can sort of think about, again, adding some bits and pieces. Again, simple prop to place everything on. So what we'll do here is quickly think about adding in some of that anatomy. Before we do that, we'll just think about roughly putting in some of the major shapes that we might find based on our stick figure mannequin, right? So if we sort of add that stuff in, it'll immediately sort of give us a nice base to work with. But yeah, what I'm basically doing here is just stick figure that is roughly based on the skeleton plus major masses. And again, what I'm doing is as I'm putting those things in, I'm just making sure, like, does stuff line up? Do I know where my center line is? So checking some basic concepts. All right, does it line up? All right, and check center. So these are things I'm constantly going over. The other things I'd sort of think about would be proportion. Right? Am I sticking to, either realistic human proportions or something that, again, is sort of exaggerating and stylizing things in a good direction? So here again, for some of the anatomical bits and pieces that I know, I can start sort of blocking them in roughly. So here again, we've got the bicep. That is going to sort of go under the pectoral, right, under the deltoid. And again, I'm just lining stuff up. And I'm also finding form. So here when we've got that, let's get another bit of paper, make that a little bit easier. So here when I've got that torso, what I'm trying to find is center. Right, find my center. And you can see there I've kind of already tried to find out those rib cage sort of elements there. And obviously those are going to sort of curve around under, and this sort of center line is going to go around the back and come out here as the spine. So what I'm trying to find is just find the dimensionality of these things, right? It's almost like I'm tracing lines around these concepts, or these sort of shapes that are going to become the major building blocks. And again, that could be, again, sort of tracing lines around here to sort of feel that space, or again, sort of just drawing lines again sort of around there to sort of help me understand what's going on with that space, where that center line is, etc., etc. What we'll do is I'll just quickly go grab some of the anatomical écorchés, and that will sort of help us understand and fill in some of these details. All right, so here we go. We've got our sort of anatomical models that we can use to help illustrate some of these points. In many cases, it's just about really, repeating these ideas until we kind of understand them. Again, we've got this concept of the rib cage that we can sort of see here. And yeah, what I'm talking about is essentially just kind of drawing lines that would kind of wrap around that form, understanding that, again, we're going to have this kind of center line that's going to come down, again, similar to this center line, similar to this center line, and that center line is going to be related, if we sort of trace it back, right, to the center line of the spine that's going to come down the back there, and it's going to hit our sort of pelvic area. And that's really what I'm trying to build here, is that feeling of those shapes. Now, it looks a little bit like, again, there's just kind of like weird see-through stuff happening. And again, that's where we sort of talk about, again, one of the other really, really important building blocks of structural drawing, which is kind of draw through. So we always want to make sure that where we need to, we draw through these concepts and sort of think about the dimensionality of the figure. So if we look at, what's happening anatomically with the sort of pelvic area, we can kind of see that, again, the center line here and the abdominal muscles that come down kind of attach to those pelvic bones. So if we look at the skeleton version of this, right, if I sort of put that there, we can refer to it easily. So what's happening is that these muscles come down here, and they're kind of attaching to these parts of the pelvic bones. So you get your abdominal muscles, right? Your sort of six-pack comes down here, and it's sort of going to attach to there, right? And again, a lot of these muscles will come up here, and that sort of pelvic bone is really where all the muscles of the leg attach to, and it's also where all the muscles of the torso attach to. So it's kind of where both of those things kind of, hook onto each other and pull quite nicely. And so we can use these little marks that we've put in, even though they're quite rough, to start placing in those concepts. And we can also look at, again, if you just have one of these little sort of anatomical models, it can really help us to think about and understand where those, primary big muscles will go, and where they, again, where they all attach to. So even though we're dealing with, almost like a comic book level of simplicity with our mannequin here, it does really help. So again, we're going to have our kneecap here, and we're going to have this muscle which comes down, so it's sort of wrapping right all the way across here, and creates these kind of interesting shapes for the knee. And then we're going to have this guy, part of our sort of quads here, it's going to fit in there, and this one is going to fit in there, right? So again, and again, once you've sort of got them there, we can sort of build them out, make them bigger or smaller. And then again, just important to understand what's going to happen here. Now, we're probably going to put clothes on this, but yeah, this is just explaining, as I often like to do, how I would normally go about this. I keep sort of saying that often, my anatomy knowledge is not you know, not really sort of world class from a practice sort of standpoint, right? There's a lot of artists who have much better sort of anatomical knowledge than me, but that's because I draw in a stylized manner, right? So I kind of, you know, I'm efficient with it. Let's say I figure out what I need to know, and I found that to in most cases be, yeah, sort of all I need to really worry about. So again, here what we've got is that torso, and if we find that center, that's where again you'll find that we can, you know, connect up a lot of these, right? A lot of these basic concepts and ideas, understand where these different muscles. Oh, I need to glue this guy's arm back on. Or maybe it's probably better to have it off, because then you can kind of look at it and talk about it. But yeah, and so here again we've got our sort of clavicle there, and yeah, you know, just having one of these sort of lying around, you can kind of like check it out and look at what's going on, what's where. Again, it is kind of like using reference, but it's not about me looking at. It's not about me sort of trying to find the pose, right? Like this is all the reference we really need, because mostly what we're looking at is just remembering where many of those insertion points are, right? Exactly what's happening. So again, we've got the bicep, and the bicep is sort of this mass that's going to, again, if we draw through, it's going to sort of go up here, right? And sort of attach in, like right in that sort of armpit there. And then we're going to have the tricep here, which again is around the back. And we're going to see the elbow kind of come out there. Except, I think, as I said, that's probably a bit long because I actually sort of draw it there. So let's sort of think about that, where that elbow is. Let's again draw that tricep a little bit higher up. Elbow is kind of there. And then we can, again, let's think about the foreshortening and the structure of that. Again, that's something I'll probably come back to. Right, and now what I'm doing is building the kind of box of the hand. We've got the hand muscles there. Let's divide it in the center, not the hand muscles, but the hand sort of shape. Put in some knuckles. Got the thumb, and again, this is where you know, if you're looking at reference, right, you can kind of look at your own hand potentially. Again, normally I'm just making these things pretty sort of comic booky, right? Not trying to be too fancy or realistic with them. And again, find the dimensionality, do the draw through when we're foreshortening. That'll always help quite a bit. I think this bicep here needs to be a little bit kind of smaller. So again, this is just construction pass, right? Think about where this cloak slash cape slash thing is going to be. And yeah, so what we'll probably have here is some kind of loincloth, or maybe something with a bit of fur on it. Right, some sort of barbarian style animal skin. Again, might have a few things on the belt line there. Again, just sketching around. We'll have another pass at this, as I said. Now let's think about going around the back, right? Trace that spine. Try and sort of visualize how it's going around the back of the rib cage, coming up at the top of the rib cage, and then coming up and attaching to the base. Oop. Need this guy down here. Yeah, to the base of the skull, just there. So that's again the thing we're trying to. Oh, there goes the other arm. There's the skull we're trying to create. All right, so we find dimensionality within that skull. We're going to use the basic Loomis construction. All right, I want him looking as much sort of that way as possible. So we find that sort of point. I'm going to draw a line down, but let's make him more monstrous. So as we find some of these points, right? So draw down to find the first kind of proportion that we would normally use, right? So if he was just a normal human, we'd see something like this, except we want to increase the size of the jaw. So what we're going to do is kind of imagine, well, look, that jaw is going to come out quite a bit, and it's going to be more. All right, draw through. So this is the perspective side of it that, often these things really solve most of the issues that people are going to have when it comes to, oh, how do I draw someone from below or above, or, etc. Like whatever it is, you're trying to draw stuff from a particular angle. Again, let's think about where these muscles of the neck go. We've got this one wrapping round. We've got the traps kind of going there. And we're going to have a nose somewhere massed in here. And as I've talked about previously, the other thing I'm going to do is kind of mass in this idea of a giant, of sort of like a larger kind of mandible. That's probably sticking out a little bit far, but maybe not. Let's see. All right, so we're going to have teeth, all right, teeth going there, teeth, and then again, draw the lips kind of around those teeth. We're probably going to have to stick this chin out a little bit more, but again, that's going to give us that. And again, this nose might have to pop up a little bit. Think about center. There's the nostril. Boom, boom, boom. Right. So again, it's kind of often that case where, when we do that, when I do that first sort of, draw the giant bowl for the mandible, it's like, oh, that's a bit much. But actually, that's probably how much we needed. Boom. Put in an ear. Boom, 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 boom. And again, let's go with our sort of standard orc hair, which is kind of going here. And some standard orc. Again, think about some trinkets, things falling off here. Boom, boom. Some eyes. Again, I'm not going to have the eyes sort of open. We probably don't have sort of room with this size. And then we're going to have this. Again, this is the cloak here. Boom. Boom. And what I'm going to do is draw what's going on with this axe thing before I get lost in any of those other sort of details. So this pencil is starting to get very soft and very in need of sharpening. But again, that can be good to kind of, make sure I don't get too detailed with anything. We don't go too far. again, let's do some simple stuff to help us. Now that we've got that kind of in there, I'm just going to do this very faintly and see whether that feels like that could work. All right. Kind of looks okay to me. Yeah, something, right, something like that. Again, let's draw in a big, following our elliptical sort of mastery guidelines. Again, I have a whole video just talking on, on the channel, talking about how to master your ellipses and get control of that stuff. So again, a good way to kind of think about this, again, just taking a look at that drawing from a different angle. Yeah, a good way to think about this is, let's just start with a box, right? Let's go back to our box logic. All right, so we've sort of got a box here. And the idea with this is that, right, it's kind of coming at us. So even if it was not, even if we didn't have a really crazy look on this axe, it's still going to be sort of coming at us a fair bit. We want to sort of push that foreshortening. Again, this, in the same way, this hand is probably a little bit bigger than it would otherwise normally be. Now, if you really get stuck here, one of the things you can do is kind of plan out what that shape looks like, right, in 2 dimensions, and then try and sort of do a similar thing. So, for instance, although the plane is gonna be a little bit more sort of here, right? So if I sort of think about that, right, think about as if I'm sort of drawing something here. Right, do all that stuff, boom. Then that'll sort of help. And this is why, again, doing all these simple little drawing exercises, right, where we try and, line stuff up, etc. It's so useful because this is the exact same thing I'm using here, pretty much. Boom, boom. So I know where that kind of center of it is going. It's coming out here, and it's obviously going to drop down quite a bit. And I'm just sort of looking for it's moving around. Just looking for like a cool kind of angle there. And again, it's I don't want it to be too exaggerated, right? So, yeah, we don't have to be super accurate with it by any means. Again, here we're still able to see underneath. Here we're able to see underneath. And then we can maybe finesse exactly what the side of it looks like. Again, we've still got that center, so I can play around with putting something on the top there to kind of make that fit. And obviously we have the sharpened bit of the axe there, and then when we start to play around and add detail to it, we can, let's find the center of that again. Let's find some sort of grid bits and pieces. So yeah, once we kind of play around with adding some detail to it, we can obviously make that look a little bit more interesting. At the moment it's a bit blocky. And again, it doesn't really make sense that the axe would be that big. It looks, it's kind of like might actually be a little bit sort of silly. Maybe let's chop the top off it. See, something like that might feel a little bit more realistic. Yeah. And again, we can see the bottom of these things. So there we go. We've got pretty much most of that initial sort of block-in done. So the next step is to kind of pull some of that back and start thinking about adding detail. All right, and so one of the things we need to add that detail is a sharp pencil. Now, I might leave some of this stuff here, and we can make this a little bit sketchier, because when we scan this in the next sort of installment of this, in the next video where we scan this in, we can, you know, clean this up in Photoshop. And I think that's an important skill as well, to sort of know how far you need to go. Especially because sometimes when we're doing this, you don't have paper that's this higher quality. Frequently, what I would do is, when I have paper that is of lower quality, is I just sort of do this erasing in Photoshop, and you can clean up quite a sketchy image, you know, to a pretty like, you know, high degree. You can, you know, take a lot of stuff out just through doing this in Photoshop, and you can really get rid of it, you know. And the other thing is that, you know, in many cases the sketchiness can sort of add texture, and even though, you know, we might not want it everywhere, you can always, you know, like where you really need a highlight, or where that you know, these sort of lines or the draw through is really getting in the way, you can completely erase it where you need. You can also wait until the whole thing is sort of done, and you can sort of still erase halfway through your coloring process. So there's lots of options. You don't need to, again, especially when we're being spontaneous, and, you know, I know I'm not doing this for a client, right? It doesn't have to have some AAA level of polish on it. Yeah, there's often sort of good opportunity to actually use some of this pencil mess to help add texture and a little bit of movement to the image. Now, this is something, again, that I struggled with a lot over the years, because I frequently would be, you know, saying, hey, I really like sketchy art. You know, I like things to be messy, but from a professional standpoint, again, people don't often like things to be that sketchy and messy. So again, that's like one of these sort of constant, you know, things you've got to deal with as an artist is, you know, who's going to appreciate it when it's messy, and what's the difference between your messiness and someone else's messiness. And to me, again, this really is just a matter of foundation and fundamental drawing knowledge. I would always be very frustrated because I always had a very sketchy style, and it was always unfinished, and people would always make comments like, oh, that's great, can't wait till you finish it. And I'd sort of be sitting there thinking, hey, I already finished it. I don't know how to add anything else, you know, like that's all I got. You know, for the life of me, I didn't know how to add more detail. And I think really the difference between sort of your sketchiness as an amateur that kind of doesn't work, right, that just kind of feels like, oh, it's messy, is often a matter of foundation, right? It's understanding that, you know, I might be making a few little random silly marks here, and because I've kind of, you know, studied that foundation, you know, a little bit, I'm able to do maybe a better job now of suggesting that this is, you know, some kind of like animal fur or something like that. Again, using very simple techniques, you know, I'm not rendering it perfectly or anything like that. But again, my ability to do that now is a lot greater because I've had a lot of practice, and I've actually practiced drawing it in more detail, right, where I am paying more attention and I'm not being as sketchy with it. And that was often the difference. Before, I sort of didn't actually know how to draw it, and I was hoping that maybe I would be able to get away with kind of never really knowing how to draw it. And, I just kind of hope that maybe if I just sort of, maybe if I just kind of sketched away and, made things kind of as messy and as sort of rubbishy as I could, and I was just ambiguous, that mine would sort of look like a lot of these professional artists who were doing the same thing. And the difference is, again, foundation and basic drawing knowledge is your ability to suggest needs to be built on a foundation of knowing how not to suggest, right? How to render things properly. And that's often what you find with people who are very good at, sort of painting, where the idea of suggestion and subtlety and, these loose strokes and doing a lot of these really sophisticated things, that's where this would come from, right? Is once you can do the very detailed, version of the rendering, then it becomes easy to kind of just sort of get a brush and kind of suggest a lot of these things and, sort of make these very detailed and rough marks at the same time. That is an advanced skill, and it's something that is very hard to learn just through being sort of sketchy and loose. You're much better off learning it by, again, practicing to, render stuff in a fairly sort of anal retentive, detailed way, or at least that's what I've sort of found in my experience, and that's what's made the difference for me. But again, with these, I'm mostly just focusing on drawing some rough sort of environment. Again, as I've sort of talked about, normally just sort of doing some sort of rocks or some landscape that says, hey, it's outside. All right, that's really what this is kind of saying. All right, so this is where what you need is your sneaky little bit of paper. If you started at the bottom like I have, I started at the bottom there because I, had a really sharp pencil and I didn't want to go too far. So here again, I've got a pencil that's a little bit sharp. There's a couple of ways you can deal with that. Again, just sort of start somewhere that's not as important. Let's maybe try not to do it too much when it's, up at the face. Although again, once you're sort of in the flow of adding detail, it may be that, we kind of need to start at the face with this small pencil, because this is what's going to give us the detail there. Again, you often have the choice when you're, dealing with these subjects to suggest or to kind of go in there and actually draw every little tooth, right? And that's often, another massive challenge, right? Is understanding like how detailed do you want to go and where do you want to add that detail. If I do too much, drawing of specific individual teeth, it might look a little bit sort of gross. So it's often a matter of subtlety, right? Exactly how much can you get away with? Got some kind of buckle here. And again, I'm just trying to, get this done relatively quickly. Just think about putting in that might be a bit much shading for the moment. Let's get rid of some of this other draw through stuff so that I don't have to be quite as strong with my shading. So that's often something that does happen. I ended up having to go too strong with the shading there, because I was having to kind of fight some of that drawing that was happening underneath. So if we erase it and go a little bit lighter there. Yeah, that is wrong. That does not go there. Gonna have again like a pretty serious Adam's apple, I'm assuming. And again, I'm just sort of roughing up the edge of this sort of cape thingy, because that makes it feel a little bit more like it's again, not something that he just purchased off the shelf yesterday. Maybe it's seen a bit of action. So here again, I'm putting in a lot of little details, sort of roughing this stuff in. Again, kind of the idea of there being a necklace or something like that is on top of this. Right, putting in these shadows. Boom. Let's get this silhouette right. Down here, simplify those shapes a little bit, simplify what's going on over there. Have this hair come through here. Again, I'm going to lose those edges. We don't need those edges to be super tight. And I'll draw what's happening under there a little bit later. Again, we got this pectoral coming here. And again, if you look at the one of the things that again always caught me up, right, was the idea of like, okay, here we're going to have maybe that sort of belly button or whatever, but you can kind of see that, right, like the quote unquote six pack is kind of often all done by the time 1, 2, 3, right, 1, 2, 3, right, that's kind of your sort of normal sort of six pack area, and it kind of, that is all above the navel there. Right, and then we've sort of got the 8 pack sort of going down there, but that often doesn't sort of show itself in quite the same way. Probably certainly not with this character who has a lot more sort of fat on their frame. But I'll leave the 6 pack in there because it's one of those anatomical things people are often wanting to draw. But what I'm going to do is suggest where it goes. I'm not going to sit there, sort of tracing out all of the different bits to it. And I might take that back again a little bit if we can. And again, we can think about these muscles here, right, which sort of come down, right, and they sort of knit into what's going on under there. Now, there's again, I guess it's sort of one thing to place these. It's another thing to, sort of go in there and draw them all out, right? So again, you have to be doing two things, right? One is sort of saying, where does that muscle go, right? What's actually, right? Like what's happening there, right? Where does that muscle go? The other thing is, should I draw it, right? Is that too much? Is that sort of just going to make it look like again, one of those like weird superhero comic books, right, where you can just see every muscle striation through the latex suit, which just doesn't seem very realistic to me at all. So again, this is the choices. What do you want to draw? What's important? How much musculature do you want to be there? Right, where do we draw this line? Right, because that's the musculature. There's often quite a bit of fat around the pectoral area. And again, those 6 pack might start down a little bit lower. I'm not sure. That might be a little bit of an amateur job there. Again, these things are very specific to the individual. It's precisely how someone's pectoral muscles sort of show, what shape they are. A lot of that stuff is, a complicated mix of genetics. Some people just are going to have different shapes, and other people are going to develop them differently, figure out different, like different bodybuilding techniques, or they're going to do different things. Someone who
does one type of gymnastics is going to look different to someone who does another type of gymnastics. A really good way to kind of see this when we're dealing with sort of functional muscle is to look at people who do sort of martial arts and other sort of sports that are really critical, right? So no one's training for hypertrophy or sort of particular muscle looks. Everyone's training for very, very functional, really serious uses, because you're not sitting there training your abs if you're an MMA fighter, because if you work the wrong muscles and focus on the wrong thing, you get sort of knocked out, right? So everyone's being very functional, and it's interesting to see again the different interesting shapes that are created from those different sort of functional needs, right? Again, people who are doing sort of swimming or diving or gymnastics and different types of gymnastics are going to be very different to weightlifting, right? And a lot of those things are, the way that people look is dictated by the needs of the sport that they're into. But to a certain degree as well, if someone is genetically predisposed to a particular sport, they're probably going to, have sort of done it, right? So again, you're going to see people who are a particular type of human doing, shot put or, really heavy lifting versus other kind of sports, right? A lot of it is kind of choice, some of it's and training, some of it is just that you're genetically built that way. So anyway, it's often a different sort of, there's different reasons people might look different ways, and you can look at the standard model. One of the best things to do to sort of deviate from that, though, is to go, look at real people who are sort of doing the right thing. One of the things that, a good friend of mine always sort of talked about is, if you're drawing these kind of barbarian characters, you really want to look more at sort of the strongman archetype, which I'm not doing here, because I've got these sort of giant, sort of chiseled abs there. But, someone who is more of a, like an orc or a strong barbarian type might follow more of that strongman sort of aesthetic, which is less about sort of abs and more just about sort of strength. And you often have to eat so much food to kind of do that and get that sort of energy going that you end up being just huge in every way. And often they have much more sort of like barrel-chested looks. Again, you're not going to see sort of ab separation as much. Everything's just sort of big, and again, it can be really good to separate those things out, especially if you're doing character design for a living, right? Being able to sort of really think that way is very useful. I just remember again, if you're sort of thinking about sort of Western comics and the sort of the anatomy that they often use, again, it's the Superman, Batman identical anatomy, but with a different sort of latex suit on is really not by design. That's just because that's the functional needs of that medium, right? People need to be able to, just essentially draw one anatomical figure and have it work for them, no matter, what book they're on. So you often find that, people are really just drawing the same human, right? And in this panel it's Batman, and this panel it's Superman. Most people aren't sort of drawing a different human. They're just drawing the same one with a different costume. And that, I think, is one of the major reasons that superhero look sort of took off, right? It was originally created, as far as I understand. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. If you have some legit sort of first-hand or detailed second-hand knowledge of that, let me know. But again, my understanding is a big reason that look kind of took off was because you, as an artist, you could effectively, draw different sort of characters each month without having to redesign them. And as soon as that aesthetic took off, people kind of really jumped into it, because again, having to design and draw, like, if you have very different anatomical figures, that you have to kind of keep control of and draw from panel to panel and keep them different sizes. This man's a strong man. This guy's a little sort of guy like Bruce Lee, this is like a, like a gymnast, right? One of those people who does the twirling around with the ribbons and stuff. And it's like, oh, they've all got different anatomical looks. It's like, that's really hard to do, especially if, the next month you get put on a different book with different characters. So typically what you find is, again, that sort of standardization across the Western superhero look is very much just a functional necessity. It's not necessarily good. It's, sort of often leads to lack of true character, compared to, often you see, much more varied designs in video games and things because they can do that. Anyway, small aside, but keep that stuff in mind, right? In terms of when you're thinking about, how should I draw this character? If I want them to be really, really strong. Again, there's lots and lots of different ways. It doesn't just have to be that sort of typical Western superhero look. It's not because there's no inherent reason that's better or worse than anything else. That's often just because that's what people had to do when they were working artists back in the golden age. You didn't have time to really design different characters. Let's just draw the same one and we'll draw a different suit pattern on them and pretend they're different. And it worked. Really, really easy to see the difference. Again, a good example of where we were, as an artistic community, building up styles and things, over time. Interesting solutions came out of very real technical timeline, deadline restrictions, and you get this idea of creating the same character with different sort of costumes, but then you focus on making the costumes interesting, and then you get all these interesting costumes. And then they're iconic, and you have to make them look different. So they come up with all these cool, different costumes, and then superheroes are born. And then 100 years later, they try and make that look good on movies and fail for a long time because it just looks ridiculous. And then eventually, they kind of figure it out, like they sort of did with Iron Man. A lot of the MCU figure out how to make those costumes and that idea kind of work. And then it kind of, people still like it. So but that idea of these really sort of day-glow costumes with standard sort of boring people in them that all look the same works really well for comics. Did not work well for cinema until they kind of figured out how to make the costumes work, because they just always looked a bit silly, right? Before the sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe really sort of took hold. I think so anyway. And these are the kind of things I think about and talk about as I'm just noodling around and drawing drawing grass. So anyway, apologies, I'm not going through a lot of the technical drawing stuff that I'm doing. Basically, I'm just drawing grass, noodling around. But there we have it. So again, I feel like this will probably do. I think we'll be able to, have a look at this, create something interesting from this. I am gonna, not quite sure about the face again. A lot of what we need to do is probably more suggestion, and I think that'll kind of work okay. Right. And again, we'll be able to, we'll have another sort of go with the rendering and a little bit of the color that we add to kind of help refine some of these things. So, we don't have to get it 100% right here on, with the pencil. Again, it's not really so much about his face, right? A lot of that is going to be suggested. So just going through there. All right. punching a few of those little key shapes to hold it together. But again, the main thing is that's going to work there is just the silhouette, right? The silhouette kind of looks okay. I think the rest will kind of work okay. I don't need to kind of think about, adding shadows or anything like that to this. I don't think that's gonna help us too much. So anyway, that's probably all for this one. What we will do is in a follow-up video, I will scan this in, and we'll talk about how we scan it in, and how we sort of prep that in Photoshop, and we'll add some quick color and try and make a spontaneous little illustration from this. But that's basically how I would handle this type of process, just playing around, responding to the drawing, seeing what works, but we still follow that basic step-by-step idea. Start with a plan. Once you kind of have a plan, then we'll sort of add as much of this kind of structure and proportion, make sure that's all sort of trued up as we can. And once you kind of have that in there, it's just a matter of like, how much detail can we add in the sort of time that we have? And, you can see again, the timeline for this is probably, an hour and a little bit maybe, and then we'll probably spend the same amount of time rendering. So that's always, again, something else that's really worth thinking about as you go into this, is considering what are you going to spend on it time-wise, because if I know I'm only going to spend 2 hours overall on it, then maybe it's not worth spending heaps and heaps of time on the thumbnail and all that other stuff. It's just a matter of sort of repeating and building that muscle for creating images, finishing images, and putting them out into the world, seeing what people think, rinse, repeat, do it again, do it again. Very different to the type of more detailed process, as I keep saying, that you would probably need to create a finished sort of illustration for a cover, even though this one again is not hyper detailed. But again, these are all different elements that you need to build, different sort of areas that you can strengthen your artistic ability, so that overall you have a nice well-rounded skill set, and you can respond spontaneously when you are sort of sketching around, and you can also have the ability to have a reliable ability to take a sketch to a finished image, and be confident with your clients that you can actually get that happening and get that done. Again, they're different things, and I frequently been in situations where I got really good at just kind of making stuff up, but that didn't work so well for me from a career standpoint, because often what clients want is they want the thumbnail and then they want the finish to match exactly the thumbnail. So these are all different elements of your skill set that you need to build, and I think they work together quite nicely. But this is the spontaneous approach. Hopefully this has been interesting. As I said, I'll make a video to follow this up, either sort of next week or sometime. So if you're watching this later on, there'll be a link in the description somewhere to it. But otherwise, yeah, I'll see you in the next video. That's all I got for this one. Catch you around. Happy drawing.